else I'll just play the footage. We'll wait till people get on or whatever. Okay. So we're gonna read 1984 over the course of. Let me just put this away. Over the course of this entire thingamajiggy. I don't know. It's like 300 pages. We'll make it through eventually. Jesus Christ, have I tried that? Okay. Just leave it there. Okay. Page 1.
Huh?
Reading.
Ah! Should I mute?
I don't know if you feel like it. Adds character to the
Mute.
stream.
Jason Falls.
I mean, I get bored as well. So, I don't know. You can add comments of your own. It was a bright, cold day in April. The clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. His hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to a wall. It simply depicted an enormous face, more than 1 meter wide, the face of a man of about 45, with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 at the time, had a varicose ulcer right above his right ankle. Went slowly, resting several times along the way. On each landing, opposite to each shaft, the poster with an enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. Inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading off a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came along from an oblong metal plaque, like a dulled mirror, which was formed part of the surface of the right-hand wall. Winston turned the switch, and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window, a smallish, frail figure, the meagerness of his body merely emphasized by the blue overalls which were the uniform of the party. His hair was very fair, and his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by the coarse soap and blunt razor blades and the white cold of the winter that had just ended. Outside, even through the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down in the little street eddies of wind were whirling dusts and torn paper into spirals, and though the sun was shining and the sky harsh blue, there seemed to be no color in anything except the posters that were plastered everywhere. The black mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one on the house front, immediately opposite. Big Brother's watching you, the caption said, while the dark eyes looked deep into Winston's own. Down at street level, another poster, torn in one corner, flapped fitfully at the wind, alternately covering and uncovering a single word, Inksock. In the far distance, a helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a blue bottle, and then darted away, with curving flight. It was the police patrol, snooping into people's windows. The patrols did not matter, however, only the thought police mattered. Behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen was still babbling away about pig iron and overfulfillment of the 9 3-year plan. The telescreen had received and transmitted simultaneously. Any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper would be picked up by it. Moreover, as long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time, but at any rate they could plug into your wire whenever they wanted to. You had to live, did live, from habit that became instinct, and the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. Winston kept his back turned to the telescreen. It was safer, though, as he knew well, even a back can be revealing. A kilometer away, the Ministry of Truth, his place of work, towered vast and white over the grimy landscape. This, he thought, with a sort of vague distaste, this was London, the chief city of Airstrip 1, itself the third most populous of the provinces of Oceania. He tried to squeeze out some childhood memory that should tell him whether London had always been quite like this. There were always these vistas of rotting 19th century houses, their sides shored up with balks of timber, and windows patched with cardboard, and the roofs with corrugated iron, and their crazy garden walls sagging in all directions, and the bomb sites where the plaster dust swirled in the air, and the willow herbs straggled over the heaps of rubble, and the places where bombs had cleared a larger path and had sprung up like sordid colonies of wooden dwellings like chicken houses. But it was no use. He could not remember. Nothing remained of his childhood except a series of bright-lipped tablelocks, according to against no background, mostly unintelligible. The Ministry of Truth, in Mini-True in Newspeak, was startlingly different from any other object in sight. It was an enormous pyramid structure of glittering white concrete, soaring up terrace after terrace, 300 meters into the air. From where Winston stood, it was just possible to read, picked out on its white face in elegant lettering, the three slogans of the party: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. The Ministry of Truth contained, as it was said, 3,000 rooms above ground level and corresponding ramifications below. Scattered about London, there were just 3 other buildings of similar appearance and size. So completely did they dwarf the surrounding architecture. From that roof of Victory Mansions, you could see all 4 of them simultaneously. They were the homes of the 4 ministries between which the entire apparatus of government was divided. The Ministry of Truth, which concerned itself with the news, entertainment, education, and the fine arts. The Ministry of Peace, which concerned itself with war. The Ministry of Love, which maintained law and order. The Ministry of Plenty, which was responsible for economic affairs. Their names, in Newspeak: Mini-True, Mini-Pax, Mini-Love, Mini-Plenty. The Ministry of Love was a really frightening one. There were no windows in it at all. Winston had never been inside the Ministry of Love, nor within half a kilometer of it. The place was impossible to enter, except for an official business. Then only by penetrating through the maze of barbed wire entanglements, steel doors, hidden machine-gun nests. Even the streets leading up to its outer barriers were roamed by gorilla-faced guards in black uniforms with jointed truncheons. Winston turned around abruptly. He had set his features into the expression of quiet optimism, which was advisable to wear when facing a telescreen. He crossed the room to the tiny kitchen. By leaving the ministry at this time of the day, he had sacrificed his lunch in the canteen, and he was aware that there was no food in the kitchen except for a hunk of dark-colored bread, which had got to be saved for tomorrow's breakfast. He took down from the shelf a bottle of colorless liquid and a plain white label named marked Victory Gin. It gave off a sickly, oily smell, as of a Chinese rice spirit. Winston poured out nearly a teapful, nerved himself for a shock, and gulped it down like a dose of medicine. Instantly his face turned scarlet, and the water ran out of his eyes. The stuff was like nitric acid, and moreover, in swallowing it, had the sensation of being hit on the back of the head by a rubber club. The next movement, however, the burning in his belly had died down, and the world began to look more cheerful. He took a cigarette from a crumpled packet marked Victory Cigarettes, and incautiously held it upright, whereupon the tobacco fell out onto the floor. But the next he was more successful. He went back to the living room and sat down at a small table that stood to the left of the telescreen. From the table drawer he took out a penholder, a bottle of ink, a thick quarto-sized blank book with a red, black, and marbled cover. For some reason, the telescreen in the living room was at an unusual position. Instead of being placed as it was normal at the end of a wall, where it could command the whole room, it was in the longer wall opposite to the window. One side of it was a shallow alcove in which Winston was now sitting, and which, when the flats were built, had probably been intended to hold bookshelves. By sitting in the alcove and keeping well back, Winston was able to remain outside the range of the telescreen, as so far as sight went. He could be heard, of course, but so long as he stayed in his present position, he could not be seen. It was partly the unusual geography of the room that had suggested to him that the thing he was about to do. But it had also been suggested by the book that he had just taken out of the drawer. It was a particularly beautiful book. Its smooth, creamy paper, a little yellowed by age, was the kind that had not been manufactured for at least 40 years past. He could guess, however, that the book was much older than that. He had seen it lying in the window of a frowsy little junk shop in a slummy quarter of town, just what quarter he did not remember now, and had been stricken immediately by an overwhelming desire to possess it. Party members were supposed to not go into ordinary shops, dealing on the free market, it was called, but the rule was not strictly kept, because there were various things such as shoelaces, razor blades, which it was impossible to get hold of in any other way. He had given a quick glance up and down the street, and slipped inside and bought the book for $2.50. At the time he was not conscious of wanting it for any particular purpose. He had carried it guiltily home in his briefcase. Even with nothing written in it, it was a compromising possession. The thing that he was about to do was to open the diary. This was not illegal. Nothing was illegal, since there were no longer any laws, but if detected, it was reasonably certain that it would be punished by death, or at least by 25 years in a forced labor camp. Winston fitted a nib into the pen holder and sucked it to get the grease off. The pen was an archaic instrument, seldom even used for even signatures, and he had procured one furtively and with some difficulty, simply because of the feeling that the beautiful creamy paper deserved to be written on it with a real nib instead of being scratched with an ink pencil. Actually, he was not used to writing by hand. Apart from very short notes, it was usual to dictate everything into the speakwrite, which of course was impossible for his present purpose. He dipped the pen into the ink, and then faltered for just a second. A tremor had gone through his bowels. To mark the paper was a decisive act. Then in small, clumsy letters he wrote, April 4th, 1984. He sat back. A sense of complete helplessness had descended upon him. To begin with, he did not know with any certainty that this was 1984. It must be round about that date, since he was fairly sure that his age was 39, and he believed that he had always been born in 1944 or 1945, but it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two. For whom it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary for the future? For whom it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary for the future, for the unborn? His mind hovered for the moment of the doubtful age on the page, then fetched up with a bump against the newspeak word doublethink. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him. How could you communicate with the future? It was of its nature impossible. Either the future would resemble the present, in which case it would not listen to him, or it would be different from it, and his predicament would just be meaningless. For some time he sat gazing stupidly at the paper, till the screen had changed over to strident military music. It was curious that he seemed to not merely have lost the power of expressing himself, but also have forgotten what it was that he had originally intended to say. For weeks past he had been marking ready for this moment, and it had never crossed his mind that saying anything would be needed except courage. The actual writing would be easy. All he had to do was transfer paper into the interminable, restless monologue that had been running inside his head, literally for years. At this moment, however, even the monologue had dried up. Moreover, his varicose ulcer had begun itching unbearably. He dared not to scratch it, because if he did, it always became inflamed. Seconds were ticking by. He was conscious of nothing except the blankness of the page in front of him, the itching of his skin above his ankle, and the blaring of the music, and a slight booziness caused by the gin. Suddenly, he began writing in sheer panic, only imperfectly aware of what he was setting down. His small but childish handwriting straggled up and down the page, shedding its first capital letters and finally even its full stops. April 4th, 1984. Last night to the flicks. All war films. One very good one about a ship full of refugees being bombed somewhere in the Mediterranean. Audience much amused by shots of great huge fat man trying to swim away with a helicopter after him. First you saw him wallowing along in the water like a porpoise, Then you saw him through the helicopter's gun sights, and then he was full of holes, and the sea around him turned pink as he sank suddenly through the holes and had let in the water. Audience shouting with laughter when he sank. Then you saw a lifeboat full of children with a helicopter hovering over it. There was a middle-aged woman that might have been a Jewess sitting in the bow with a little boy about 3 years old in her arms. The little boy screaming with fright and hiding his head in between her breasts as if he was trying to burrow right into her, and the woman putting her arms around him, comforting him, although she was blue with fright herself, all the time covering him up as much as possible, as though her arms could keep the bullets off of him. Then the helicopter planted a 20-kilo bomb among them in a terrific flash, and the boat went all to matchwood. Then there was a wonderful shot of a child's arm going up, 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 right up into the air, and a helicopter with a camera in its nose must have followed it up there. There was a lot of applause from the party seats, but a woman down in the pearl part of the house suddenly started kicking up a fuss and shouting that they didn't oughter to show it in front of the kids. It ain't right, not in front of the kids. It ain't until the police turned her out. I don't suppose anything happened to her, and no one cares what the proles say in typical prole reaction. They never. Winston stopped writing, partly because he was suffering from cramp. He did not know what had made him pour out the stream of rubbish, but the curious thing was that while he was doing so, a totally different memory had just clarified itself in his mind, to the point where he almost felt equal to writing it down. Now he realized, because of this other incident, he had suddenly decided to come home and begin the diary today. It happened so that at the morning at the ministry, if anything so nebulous said could happen. Okay, quick pause. Okay, so it's been like 10 minutes. What, 10 minutes? Very cool. 17 minutes, about 20 minutes. I hope you guys are enjoying the footage. This is some games I played with my buddy Daniel, like a couple, maybe like months back. Maybe weeks, I don't really remember. I don't even know why I started recording this. But he pulled off one of the best clutches I've ever seen. Okay, shall we continue? The curious thing was that while he was doing so, a totally different memory had clarified itself in his mind, to the point where he almost felt equal to writing it down. It was, he now realized, because of this other incident that he had suddenly decided to come home and begin the diary today. It happened that morning at the ministry, if anything so nebulous could be said to happen. It was nearly 1100 in the records department where Winston worked, and they were dragging chairs out of the cubicles and grouping them in the center of the hall, opposite to the big telescreen, in preparations for the 2-minute hate. Winston was just taking his place in one of the middle rows when two people who he knew by sight but had never spoken to came unexpectedly into the room. One of them was a girl who he often passed in the corridors. He did not know her name, but he knew that she worked in the fiction department, presumably since she had sometimes seen her with oily hands and carrying a spanner. She had some mechanical job on one of the novel-writing machines. She was a bold-looking girl of about 27 with thick, dark hair, a freckled face, and swift, athletic movements. A narrow scarlet sash, emblem of the Junior Anti-Sex League, was wound several times around the waist of her overalls, just tightly enough to bring out the shapeliness of her hips. Winston had disliked her from the very first moment of seeing her. He knew the reason. It was because of the atmosphere of the hockey fields and cold baths and community hikes, and her general clean-mindedness, which she managed to carry about with her. He disliked nearly all women, especially the young and pretty ones. It was always the women, and above all the young ones, who were the most bigoted adherents of the party, the swallowers of slogans, the amateur spies, and nosers-outs of unorthodoxy. But this particular girl gave him the impression of being more dangerous than most. Once they had passed in the corridor, she had given him a quick sidelong glance which seemed to pierce right into him, and for a moment had filled him with black terror. The idea had even crossed his mind that she might be an agent of the thought police. That it was true, well, very unlikely. That it was true was very unlikely. Still, he continued to feel a particular uneasiness, which had fear mixed up in him as well as hostility, whenever she was anywhere near him. The other person was a man named O'Brien, a member of the inner party, a holder of some post so important and remote that Winston only had a dim idea of its nature. A momentary hush passed over the group of people around the chairs as he saw the black overalls of an inner party member approaching. O'Brien was a large, burly man with a thick neck, a coarse, humorous, brutal face. In spite of his formidable appearance, he had a certain charm of manner. He had a trick of resettling his spectacles on his nose, which was curiously disarming, in some indefinable way, and curiously civilized. It was a gesture which, if anyone had still thought in such terms, might have recalled an 18th century nobleman offering a snuff-box. Winston had seen O'Brien perhaps a dozen times in almost as many years. He felt deeply drawn to him, not solely because he was intrigued by the contrast between O'Brien's urbane manner and his prize-fighter's physique. Much more of it was because of a secretly held belief, or perhaps not even a belief, merely a hope, that O'Brien's political orthodoxy was not perfect. Something in his face suggested it irresistibly, and then again, perhaps it was not even an orthodoxy that it was written in his face, but simply intelligence. But at any rate, he had the appearance of being a person that you could talk to, if you somehow could cheat the telescreen and get him alone. Winston never made the smallest effort to verify this guess. Indeed, there was no way of doing so. At this moment, O'Brien glanced at his wristwatch and saw that it was nearly 1100. Evidently decided to stay in the records department until the 2 minutes haze was over. He took a chair in the same row as Winston, a couple places away. A small, sandy-haired woman who worked in the next cubicle to Winston was between them. The girl with dark hair was sitting immediately behind. The next moment, a hideous, grinding screech, as some monstrous machine was running without oil, burst from the big telescreen at the end of the room. It was a noise that set one's teeth on edge and bristled the hair at the back of one's neck. The hate had started. As usual, the face of Emmanuel Goldstein, the enemy of the people, had flashed onto the screen. There were the hisses here and there among the audience. The little sandy-haired woman gave a squeak of mingled fear and disgust. Goldstein was a renegade and the backslider who once, long ago, how long ago nobody quite remembered, had been one of the leading figures of the party, almost on a level with Big Brother himself, and then engaged in his counter-revolutionary activities and had been condemned to death, and had mysteriously escaped and disappeared. The program of the 2 minutes hate varied from day to day, but there was none in which Goldstein was not the principal figure. He was a primal traitor, one of the earliest defilers of the party's purity. All subsequent crimes against the party, all treacheries, all acts of sabotage, heresies, divations, sprang directly out of his teaching. Somewhere or other he was still alive and hatching his conspiracies, perhaps somewhere beyond the sea, under the protection of his foreign paymasters. Perhaps even so it was occasionally rumored, in hiding in some place in Oceania itself. Winston's diaphragm was constricted. He could never see the face of Goldstein without a painful mixture of emotions. It was a lean Jewish face, with a great fuzzy aureole of white hair and a small goatee beard. A clever face, and yet somehow inherently despicable, with a kind of senile silliness in the long, thin nose, near the end of which a pair of spectacles was perched. It resembled the face of a sheep, and his voice, too, had sheep-like quality. Goldstein was delivering his usual venomous attacks upon the doctrines of the party, an attack so exaggerated and perverse that a child should have been able to see through it, and yet just as plausible enough to fill one an alarmed feeling that the other people, less level-headed than oneself, might be taken in by it. He was abusing Big Brother. He was denouncing the dictatorship of the party. He was demanding the immediate conclusion of peace with Eurasia. He was advocating the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought. He was crying hysterically that the revolution had been betrayed, all this in rapid polysyllabic speech, which was sort of a parody in the habitual style of the orators of the party. He even contained newspeak words. More newspeak words indeed that any party member would normally use in real life. All the while, lest one should be in any doubt as to the reality which Goldstein's specious claptrap covered, behind his head on the telescreen there marched endless columns of the Eurasian army. Row after row of solid-looking men with expressionless Asiatic faces, who swam up to the surface of the screen and vanished, to be replaced by others exactly similar. The dull, rhythmic tramp of the soldiers' boots formed the background of Goldstein's bleeding voice. Before the hate had proceeded for 30 seconds, uncontrollable exclamations of rage were breaking out from half the people in the room. The self-satisfied sheep-like face on the screen and the terrifying power of the Eurasian army behind it, they were too much to be borne. Besides, the sight or even thought of Goldstein produced fear and anger automatically. He was an object of hatred more constant than either Eurasia or East Asia, since when Oceania was at war with one of these powers, it was generally at peace with the other. What was strange is that although Goldstein was hated and despised by everybody, although every day, 1,000 times a day on platforms, on the telescreens, in newspapers and books, his theories were refuted, smashed, ridiculed, held up to the general gaze for the pitiful rubbish that they were, in spite of all of this, his influence never seemed to grow less. There were always fresh dupes waiting to be seduced by him. A day never passed when the spies and saboteurs acting under his directions were not unmasked by the thought police. He was a command of a vast shadowy army, an underground network of conspirators, decided to overthrow the state. The Brotherhood, its name was supposed to be. There were also whispered stories of a terrible book, a compendium of all the heresies, of which Goldstein was the author, and which circulated clandestinely here and there. It was a book without title. People referred to it, if all, as simply the book. But no one knew of such things, only through vague rumors. Neither the Brotherhood or the book was subject to any ordinary party member would mention, if there was a way of avoiding it. In a second minute, the hate rose up to a frenzy. People were leaping up and down in their places and shouting at the tops of their voices in an effort to drown out the maddening, bleeding voice that came from the screen. The little sandy-haired woman turned bright pink, and her mouth was opening and shutting like that of a landed fish. Even O'Brien's heavy face was flushed. He was sitting very straight in his chair, his powerful chest swelling and quivering, so he was standing up to the assault of a wave. The dark-haired girl behind Winston began crying out, "Swine, swine, swine!" And suddenly she picked up a heavy Newspeak dictionary and flung it at the screen. It struck Goldstein's nose and bounced off. The voice continued inexorably. In a lucid moment, Winston found that he was shouting with the others, kicking his heel violently against the rung of his chair. The horrible thing about the 2 minutes hate was not that one obliged to act a part, but that it was impossible to avoid joining in. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was already unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, to torture, to smash in faces with a sledgehammer, seemed to flow through the whole group of people like an electric current, turning one even against one's own will into a grimacing, screaming lunatic. And yet the rage that one felt was an abstract, undirected emotion, which could be switched from one subject to another like a flame of a blow lamp. Thus, at one moment, Winston's hatred was not turned against Goldstein at all, but on the contrary against Big Brother and the party and the thought police. And at such moments, his heart went out to the lonely, derided hectic on the screen, the sole guardian of truth and sanity in the world of lies. And yet, the very next instant, he was one with the people about him, and all that was said of Goldstein seemed to him to be true. All those moments, his secret loathing of Big Brother changed into adoration. Big Brother seemed to tower up, an invincible, fearless protector, standing like a rock against the hordes of Asia. And Goldstein, in spite of his isolation, his helplessness, and the doubt that hung about his very existence, seemed like some sinister enchanter, capable by the mere power of his voice of wrecking the structure of civilization. It was even possible, at moments, to switch one's hatred this way or by that way, a voluntary act. Suddenly, by the sort of violent effort which wrenches one's head away from the pillow in a nightmare, Winston succeeded in transferring his hatred from the face on the screen to the dark-haired girl behind him. Vivid, beautiful hallucinations flashed through his mind. He would flog her to death with a rubber truncheon. He would tie her naked to a stake and shoot her full of arrows like Saint Sebastian. He would ravish her and cut her throat at the moment of climax. Better than before, moreover, he realized why it was that he hated her. He hated her because she was young, pretty, and sexless, because he wanted to go to bed with her, and would never do so, because her round, sweet, supple waist, which seemed to ask you to encircle it with your arm, there was only the odysseus scarlet sash, the aggressive symbol of chastity. The hate rose to its climax. The voice of Goldstein became an actual sheep's bleat, and for an instant the face changed into that of a sheep. And the sheep face melted into the figure of a Eurasian soldier who seemed to be advancing, huge and terrible, his submachine gun roaring and seeming to spring out of the surface on the screen, so that some of the people in the front row actually flinched backwards in their seats. But at the same moment, drawing a deep sigh of relief from everybody, the hostile figure melted into the face of Big Brother, the black-haired, black-mustachioed, full of power and mysterious and calm, and so vast it almost filled up the screen. Nobody heard what Big Brother was saying. It was merely a few words of encouragement, and the sort of words that were uttered in the din of battle, not distinguishable individually, but restoring confidence by the fact of being spoken. And the face of Big Brother faded away. Instead, the three slogans of the party stood out in bold capitals. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Okay, I think I might cut it here. It's been kind of going on for like half an hour. Unless anybody cares to oppose.
I oppose going for another half hour.
No. Another half hour? You really want another whole half hour?
Actually, no. Just read the whole book.
Dude, I'm on page 16.
And?
Holy moly. Okay, I'll read until the end of the chapter. There's like 4 more pages. Alright. Alright, I'll let the recording keep on playing. I just have that so there's something to look at. But the face of Big Brother seemed to persist for several seconds on screen, as though the impact of it had made on everyone's eyeballs were too vivid to wear off immediately. The little sandy-haired woman had flung herself forward from the back of her chair into front of her. With a tremulous murmur that sounded like, "My savior," she extended her arms toward the screen, then buried her face in her hands. It was apparent that she was uttering a prayer. At the moment, the entire group of people broke into a deep, slow, the rhythmical chants of B, 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 standing for Big Brother, over and over again, very slowly, with a long pause between the first B and the second, a heavy, murmurous sound, somewhat curiously savage, in the background of which one seemed to hear the stamp of naked feet and the throbbing of tom-toms. For perhaps as much as 30 seconds they kept it up. It was a refrain that was often heard in moments of overwhelming emotion. It was partly sort of a hymn to the wisdom and majesty of Big Brother, but still more it was an act of self-hypnosis, a deliberate drowning of consciousness by the means of the rhythmic noise. Winston's entrails seemed to grow cold. In the 2 minutes' hate he could not help sharing the general delirium, but the subhuman chanting of B, 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 B always filled him with horror. Of course, he chanted with the rest. It was impossible to do otherwise. To dissemble your feelings, to control your face, to do what everyone else was doing was an instinctive reaction. But there was a space of a couple seconds during which the expression of his eyes might have conceivably betrayed him. It was exactly at this moment that the significant happened, if indeed it did happen. Momentarily, he caught O'Brien's eye. O'Brien had stood up. He had taken off his spectacles, and it was in the act of setting them on his nose, in his characteristic gesture. But there was a fraction of the second, where their eyes met, and for as long as it took to happen, Winston knew, yes, he knew, that O'Brien was thinking the same thing as himself. An unmistakable message had passed. It was as though the two minds had opened and thoughts were flowing from one into the other through their eyes. "I am with you," O'Brien seemed to be saying with him. "I know precisely what you are feeling. I know all about your contempt, your hatred, your disgust. But don't worry, I am on your side." And then, as the flash of intelligence was gone, and O'Brien's face was indestructible as everybody's else, inscrutable. That was all. He was already uncertain whether it had happened. Such incidents had never had any sequel. All that they did was to keep him alive in the belief or hope that others beside himself were enemies of the party. Perhaps the rumors of vast underground conspiracies were true, after all. Perhaps the Brotherhood really existed. It was impossible, in spite of the endless arrests and confessions, executions, to be sure that the Brotherhood was not simply a myth. Some days he believed in it, some days not. There was no evidence, only fleeting glimpses that it might mean anything or nothing, snatches of overheard conversation, faint scribbles on lavatory walls. Once, even, when two strangers met, a small movement of the hands which looked as if it might be a signal of recognition. It was all guesswork. He very likely had imagined everything and had gone back to his cubicle without looking at O'Brien again. The idea of following up on their momentary contact hardly crossed his mind. It would have been inconceivably dangerous, even if he had known how to set about doing it. For seconds, they had exchanged an equivocal glance. That was the end of the story. But even that was a memorable event. In the locked loneliness in which one had to live, Winston roused himself and sat up straighter. He let out a belch. The gin was rising in his stomach. His eyes refocused on the page. He discovered that while he sat helplessly musing, he had also been writing, as though automatic by action. It was no longer the same cramped, awkward handwriting as before. His pen had slid voluptuously over the smooth paper, printing in large, neat capitals, "Down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother," over and over and over again, filling half a page. He could not help feeling a twinge of panic. It was absurd, since writing of those particular words was not more dangerous than the initial act of opening the diary. For a moment he was tempted to tear out the spoiled pages and abandon the enterprise altogether. But he did not do so, however, because he knew that it was useless. Whether he wrote down with Big Brother or he had refrained from writing it made no difference. Whether he went on with the diary or whether he did not go on with it made no difference. The thought police would come to get him just the same. He had committed and would still have committed even if he had never set pen to paper. The essential crime that contained all the others in itself. Thought crime, they called it. The thought crime was not a thing that could be concealed forever. You might dodge it successfully for a while, even for years, but sooner or later they were bound to get you. It was always at night. The arrests invariably happened at night. A sudden jerk out of your sleep, the rush hand shaking your shoulders, lights glaring into your eyes, the ring of hard faces around the bed. In the vast majority of cases there was no trial, no report of the arrest. People simply disappeared, always during the night. Your name was removed from the registers. Every record of everything you had ever done was wiped out. Your one-time existence was denied and then forgotten. You were abolished, annihilated, vaporized was the usual word. For a moment he was seized by a kind of hysteria. He began writing hurriedly in an untidy scrawl. "They'll shoot me, I don't care. They'll shoot me in the back of the neck. I don't care. Down with Big Brother. They always shoot you in the back of the neck. I don't care. Down with Big Brother." He sat back in his chair, slightly ashamed of himself, and laid down his pen. The next moment he started violently. It was a knocking at his door. Already, he sat still as a mouse, in futile hope that whoever it was might go away after a single attempt. But no, the knocking repeated. The worst thing of all would be to delay. His heart was thumping like a drum, but his face, from long habit, probably expressionless, got up and moved heavily towards the door. Alright, that's page 20. That's it. That's about it. I'm not doing more, because my throat is dry. My throat is very dry. Remind me, it's page 20.
$1 billion.
Okay, thanks for watching. Goodbye.
Bye, stream. Oh my god, stream. What?
I have a zero here.